Good morning and welcome to the 10th Lake County Film Festival. This is the Q&A for, my thing is wrong, John Wayne Gacy, Defending a Monster. And I'm very excited to have Marc Menet here to talk about the film. Marc, how's it going?
It's 2020. So, all things considered, our baseline has to obviously change based on the times. But all things considered, I'm healthy and my family's healthy. So, and we're grateful to be here.
And you have a new cat.
We do. So we decided to take in a rescue during COVID, which was awesome.
This is kind of the John Wayne Gacy of years, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's interesting. My life kind of there was a lot of things that I found during this film that were really interesting. And I think we were talking before this started, but my parents were actually one of my parents' best friends was one of the victims. So before I was born, he disappeared. Greg Godzik's his name. So he disappeared, and so obviously that left a scar on them. And my dad actually, my mom and dad both grew up on the Northwest side near where Gacy lived. And my dad was actually offered a job because Godzik worked for Gacy. So he, just for some reason didn't take up that job. But when I was born, I was actually being born in the blizzard of '79, which is actually featured in this film. The bodies, they actually had to kind of stop the excavation, stop the search because of that blizzard. So it really just hit home with me as I was watching the film that, as I'm being born, they had to get a Bronco, like a 4x4, which back in the late '70s, early '80s, 4x4s and SUVs weren't a common thing. Ambulance couldn't come get me because the storm was so bad. They had to get a Bronco. So as I'm getting rushed to the hospital to be born, they're digging up one of the bodies who potentially would have been somebody who met me at the hospital, who would have met my parents to meet me. So you just kind of hit home. So there's kind of some parallels with my life. And then as I'm making this film, it just kind of struck me that my current age is about the age of Gacy. He was in his late 30s. People kind of people think of him as being older. But when he was actually committing his crimes, it was in his 30s and into his 40s when he got arrested.
Not to jump around, but we were just talking about it before we went live. But Bob Schultz, who was one of the lead cops.
There was a number of cops, and it was kind of complicated because technically it was unincorporated. It was like the Des Plaines area, there's that area over by O'Hare where it gets really complicated. What's Chicago? What's Des Plaines? What's the different areas? So where Gacy lived technically was unincorporated. So the Des Plaines police were among the detectives that cracked the case because the last victim was from Des Plaines. But he technically lived in unincorporated, so it's the state jurisdiction. So there's this jurisdiction complication with the case of who had control. So there were a number of agencies and a number of police officers involved.
Well, do you think that was on purpose? Is that like
No, I honestly think that was just a quirk. I think that was just where he happened to live. I don't know that was purposeful. He just lived in a very the house is gone now. There is a house there. There's been a horror film that was made about it, and I'm sure that people who live there are aware of it. Just you kind of have to know. They did change the street number, so if you were to drive by there, and I'm sure they have they have the buses that'll go by because of the intrigue with true crime. So they changed the house number, but that lot where his house used to be, there is a current house now. They didn't just leave it empty.
So I think I told you the first time we talked that my mother-in-law and wife, they live next door to Bob Schultz. I feel like I remember when I told you that the first time you mentioned the fact that like everybody has a story. Like,
yeah, if you think about the number, yeah, I apologize, I didn't mean to step.
He touched so many. Like everyone has a Gacy story. He just influenced so many different things.
He was a precinct captain. Which I don't know if people kind of realize these days what that means, but that's a big deal. Like it's it means that you're especially in the aldermanic system, the Chicago area politics and such, you're kind of tasked with soldiering everybody, this is pre-Facebook, pre all of that. You're kind of ushering in everybody to make sure that the votes come in, that everybody finds a way to get to the voting and polling place. You're also the person that people go to. And there's a picture of him with the first lady with Carter, where, he literally is, arm in arm with the first lady when she was first lady of the United States. So it's, he basically, he was a likable guy who was just, he had giant parties. You'll hear a lot of people tell stories about like, oh, I went to one of his parties in his backyard or whatever. We talk about it in the film, but, we'd have like luau's and different social events. And I think the moment that I thought there's a number of moments in this film in the making of it that really, stuck with me. But one of them was, just everybody kind of agreeing that if he were on his own jury, he would have been elected foreman because he was so likable. Like he just, it was a mask he wore, but this mask of, of being affable and being likable and very outgoing and the guy, it's always that story, right? The guy least likely.
Yeah. So what led you to this story? I know there's a book.
Yeah, I mean, not to, so the book, it's kind of a long story. The short version of it is I've been a cinematographer for nearly 20 years, and I'd shot a film for a director named Joe Winston. I was one of several people. There was a lot of cinematographers. I just did a small section of it. It was called "What's the Matter with Kansas," which was really a great experience. I got to spend some time in Kansas, not to get political or partisan, but it's essentially about what happened in Kansas being a microcosm for what's happening in the whole United States, where there's these really, heated issues that people are voting on, even willing to vote against their own self-interests, right? To vote on some very specific things, which we can get into.
I haven't read the book. I might have seen the movie, but I've seen him as a guest on all the shows I watch.
Sure.
The Daily Show and Bill Maher, and I've seen him on there, and it's a great thesis. It's
well, that movie got was one of Ebert that year called it one of the 10 best docs of the year, which for me was like, I'm sure you too, the thumbs meant so much as a child. Like, you just dream of having a thumb for a project that you were associated with. So that was definitely a bucket list.
The movie I produced, the narrative feature I produced in Chicago, was one of the last maybe 100 or so that he reviewed, and it was, I remember I posted and I said, I'm very lucky that one of my kids was born in 2011 and one of them was born in 2013, because the best moment of 2012 is definitely Roger Ebert giving us a positive review. And I don't have to weigh that against the birth of either of my children.
There you go. Yeah. Similarly, I had, I want to make sure I get back to the topic at hand, but when we moved, I just moved to the burbs. I was a Chicagoan most of my life. So we did the cliche move to the burbs, and out here, there were still some family videos. Unfortunately, most of them have been victim to COVID, but there were a couple of family videos still right around my house. And my daughter at the time was like 5. So I made sure to take her to the family video because I had 2 films I had worked on their shelves. So I just, and I don't think she even realized it, but I made sure to get a picture of her holding a movie that I had done in this video store that I treasure. At the moment, she's like, Dad, why are you having me hold this stupid thing? She's thoroughly unimpressed. I had a TV show I did, and my name was in the credits on the TV show. So I pressed pause. I'm like, look, your dad's name. And she literally, I'm not kidding, did this puppet show thing. Look at me, my name's on the TV. Which, I can't win. But anyway, back to this idea of how the film was made. What's interesting as a cinematographer, any crew person on a shoot is, I went to film school, I teach at a film school, but I'm also a lifelong learner. So as I'm working with other producers, I'm working with other directors, or just in general, I try to take away whatever I can from a particular shoot. Just you're surrounded by lessons that you can learn. And so with Joe, I saw this idea of, and I don't even know, I've talked to him briefly, but I don't even know how much of an influence he had. I'm like, man, if you can option a book, you get a popular book, you've got a built-in audience, you've also got a built-in subject matter expert, the author of the book, and essentially you've got a framework, a blueprint for how the film could be made. So I had this idea. I'm like, man, I would love to replicate this, what Joe had done. He basically, he optioned the book. So it was just kind of fortuitous. Scott, my partner on the film, Scott Prestin, he was working on a project, and the guy he was working with was like, hey, I happen to be friends with this guy who's releasing a book. It was Danny Broderick. And it's about Gacy. Is there anything we could do with that? So then Scott came to me and we started talking. And they were talking about maybe a film or something. I was like, no, let's do a doc. Because, at the time, this was 5 or 6 years ago when we really started, the doc revolution's been going on. I think we've seen the impact of digital cameras on cinema in general, but I would argue the biggest genre that's had a big, probably the most seismic change is doc, right? Because now you don't need a film camera, you don't need expensive equipment. So, you can really tell stories. So we're seeing all these stories being told low budget that just couldn't have been done before. So yeah, we had a meeting. It was kind of this dinner, like a breaking of the bread, So we met with Sam, the subject of the film, Danny, myself and like 5 or 6 of us, and we kind of just pitched the idea, and they were in love with it. So that was and then the guy the guy who had introduced us to the book, also was a built-in investor. He was the first seed money to get the film started. So I guess that's the impetus for how this thing started.
Sweet. What main obstacles did you have in production?
Many. We had a budget, but it was actually, it's always one of those things where filmmakers try to keep it close to their vest, right? We had a budget, but it wasn't enough for us to quit our jobs, right? So I was still teaching, I was still working on other projects, and I was a new dad when this started, right? My daughter had been born, so she would have been like 1 or 2, or I don't remember exactly how old she was when we started, but anybody who has kids, like, being a dad, or anybody who has kids, being a dad is like, it's another job. So this became like my 3rd or 4th job. So right off the bat, the biggest challenge, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, is when you have a passion project, is making time for your passion project, making it a priority, even though there's other stuff going on. We'd shoot when we could, and we had a team of like 4 or 5 was our whole production team, really. Scott, myself, Tim Farrell, is a really good friend of mine who's a go-to AD here in town. And then, I'd pull favors with former students. And then we had a couple other people who would come in. We just bring in people when we could. But, just getting the locations and doing it ourselves, I think that was the big hurdle. And then shaping the story. I mean, not to compare it because it's a totally different thing. But we mentioned this again before we started this. This is like the Titanic. The end, right? It's a story about defending a person. And ultimately, our protagonist, or the person in our film who we're featuring, loses his case. So that's kind of a tough story to tell. Like, how do you tell the story of a trial? The other problem we had is there's no Matlock moment. There's no thing that you discover that cracks the case, and all of a sudden everything changes. It was actually the case itself. It was a monumental case because of the press and because but the actual case itself was pretty standard. But I guess, to us, that was the interesting thing. This horrible, at the time, serial killer who's among the most, horrific in the history of the United States. And but that gentleman still needs a defense, right? He still needs somebody to make sure that he's properly represented. Because with a case like that, there's kind of this pressure to just take him to the town hall and hang him from the rafters, kind of a thing.
Yeah, somebody needs to be there to protect their interest. I don't remember what it was. I mentioned this earlier, but I saw a doc about somebody who was clearly guilty, and the defendant said, it doesn't matter what it is. Somebody needs to defend him. Somebody needs to make sure, even if he's going to plead guilty, to make sure that somebody's negotiating on his behalf to make sure that he gets, the most fair sentence or whatever,
Well, I mean, and we as the public demand that as well, because frankly, if you have a serial killer and they don't get a proper defense, that's grounds for appeal, right? So they not only deserve, but they have to have a proper defense. It's something that we're all entitled to under the laws of our land. And that's another interesting thing is just, there's all these different myths about Gacy and things that we wanted to try and correct as best we could. But the one about Sam is, I think people who've read the book know this, but he's not some like ambulance chaser who was chasing down fame. In the book and in our film, we talk about how it all started with a phone call. He had no idea, literally no idea, that he was about to. This was his first case in private practice. He was working in Des Plaines in the public defender's office, and his first case, he's literally, and we talk about how he's like basically putting his diploma on the wall, and he gets a call from John Wayne Gacy asking if he could do him a favor. Because, according to Gacy, the cops were, here's the cat. Here's going to be the dog. I tried to get the dog. Dogs and cats living together.
Maybe your cat heard Buster bark.
Heard the dog, yeah. But he got a phone call, and as far as Sam knew, it was just about some police harassment. That's what the case was. And it wasn't until Gacy's in his office, basically laying it all on the table, confessing everything, that he's like, holy, and like as a young attorney at that point, you're like, what the hell? You've got a guy in your office, confessing to tens of to 30 murders. And, there's this moment in the film, he talks about how he had to go home and take a shower. You're like, what do you do to that? What do you, and then next thing you know, he's in the middle of the biggest case in the country at the time. Oh, you there? Sorry. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it kept recording. Hopefully, you finished your thought. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's okay. I apologize. I apologize.
Was that
We're
you?
doing
I
our
thought
best.
it might be me. I don't know.
Either one, we're doing our best. Maybe it's
Yeah,
the cat. He's drawn an interest. Um,
it's 2020. This is fine.
yeah, I mean, you asked earlier about, one of the things I wanted to mention. I was one of the only non-attorneys in this. Scott Preston's an attorney. Our investor was an attorney. Danny was an attorney. It's literally like I was the token non-lawyer in this situation. And I'd learned a bit, and that's one of the benefits of working in doc and just working in the field it's awesome just to get to where, to spend some time with experts in their field and get to know a little bit about what they do. But one of the things I was most shocked by was the mutual admiration everybody had for each other. I mean, from the shows and things that you see on TV, you get the sense of this animosity between defense attorneys and prosecutors. And not in this case. I mean, obviously both sides really want to win and both sides think they did better than the other side. But once it was all said and done, there was just nothing but admiration. I mean, the prosecutors spoke glowingly off camera even about Sam and how much they admired what he did and what, and vice versa. Sam talking about how great a job the prosecutors. And that almost presents a challenge. You're like, because you want that animosity, and I don't want to manufacture it. That's not the type of person I am. I'm very authentic, and I want to be authentic to the story. But that again presents a challenge. Like, you want to hear like, they were, and none of them said this, but you want to hear like, oh, they're a scumbag or whatever, because that makes for good TV. But in this case, what ended up happening and what we discovered while editing was what the animosity, the conflict was basically between the two sides thinking like, Sam wanting to basically save his life and preserve him, obviously he's probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But, the idea of if Gacy's not insane, who is? If you're going to have somebody who is a sociopath who buries bodies right under where he's walking in his kitchen without a thought, like if that person doesn't, if they're not, if the insanity defense doesn't fit them, then who does it fit? And then on the other side, you've basically got people who would fight to, flip the switch. So they, that led us to that kind of that face off of the two sides and how they felt about it.
I mentioned I've probably for 5-6 years now, I've become a really big true crime fan. There's so much great true crime stuff coming out, miniseries, movies. There's so many, small cases, big cases, but even small cases
Sure.
that people haven't heard of. But now, this year, I've got 3 in the festival, and there's actually another one that I programmed in another festival that are really looking at different things. They're not looking at the crimes. They're not looking at solving anything. They're really looking more at the cases and the justice. What you just said, 2 of those were 2 of the other films were also about people who were clearly suffered from mental problems and needed defenses to give them the most fair result that they can. And actually, one of them, Through the Cracks, really centers on this case that we're failing to take care of mental health in some way here. Do you think the genre is maturing? These are all independent films, but do you think we're starting to be able to branch out from the not that you're not a high profile case, but
yeah, no, I think the audience is maturing, and I think that for years we were getting, and no offense to them, I've worked on a ton of them, and when I say like these flashy, with the graphics and the and then it just, to me, I wanted no part of that. I just wanted to make a film. Like, I wanted to make a really interesting. We have some visuals and we have some graphics, but that was like supporting the story. It wasn't like, some of these on some of the cable channels become like these, like they're like ADD fueled, all kinds of stuff, and I'm just like, whoa. We didn't want to sensationalize anything. That was like rule number 1 with us. We basically wanted everything to be authentic, so everybody in the right location. Where Sam's being interviewed in the courtroom where it happened. We're in the holding cell where Gacy was being held. We're in the actual environments, and to me, that added authenticity for the film, but also putting those people in those environments, I think, added to them telling the tale. But I think, I think just audiences are becoming more sophisticated. I always tell my students that your audience isn't an expert at making a film, but your audiences are experts at watching them. As we grow up and as we watch media, we're getting trained. We're actually watching things, and we're students of watching things and experiencing them. So as new things are coming out, our audiences, I think, are becoming more sophisticated, and they're getting more options, obviously, than ever. All these streaming channels and all these things that just didn't exist before give outlets to projects that could have potentially gotten made in the past, but I don't think they'd be seen. And I think that's one of the biggest differences, is the ability to get smaller projects seen.
Cool. So what did everyone think of the film?
So far, the people who have actually seen the film, I've had a lot of really positive response, and really thought-provoking. I've had people who, because you get the family and friends where you're like, it almost doesn't count. It feels good. You want to have the people who love and care about you tell you, oh, you did a great job. But then you also want people who don't have any interest, they have any vested interest in that, also, just an audience member to say, hey. And that's one of the things, and I applaud you for doing this. The one thing, any of us as filmmakers in this 2020 cycle, I think the thing we miss the most is being able to network with each other, just to hang out and talk, but also to get that adulation, the talking to the audience and getting that reception that you get from somebody enjoying your film, or having, that's why I love doing these. At least, it's an opportunity to answer questions for people. But the response has been good. Now, the only thing we were getting, and I think this is funny, because funny is the wrong word. It's unfortunate, I guess is the best word. The authors of the book experienced this as well, is the people who want to paint us in a particular light without even seeing the project. I'm getting on our Facebook page, we're getting people talking about how we're the devil, and how could we, this person, we're profiting off of pain, and we're on and on and on. And I'm sympathetic to that. And actually, we were sympathetic to that while we were making the film. We wanted to make sure that it was really not about, we have to talk about his crimes, just because generationally there's people who don't necessarily know the backstory. So we have to set it up. But we were very purposefully choosing our frames. We were not sensationalizing things. We only show gruesome images twice. And it's really in context. We kind of had to. We talked about we interviewed the dentist who identified the bodies, and he was talking about the remains as they came in. And we have a shot of some of the remains being excavated from the basement. And it wasn't to try and horrify anybody or be grotesque or anything, other than just to put it in context that these were skeletal remains, right? Because I think there's this big myth about the basement reeking of death. If anything, it smelled of mildew, right? It was just they had a moisture problem. Because these weren't like, it was quite literally like an archaeological dig more than anything. But there goes the cat.
What about Sam and everyone else in the film? Did they?
I think, Sam was purposefully, and this is the challenge we have, and I realized not to even compare the two, but I know the Michael Jordan documentary was getting some flack because Michael Jordan was involved in the production. He gets a producing credit. And I can't speak for that film. I wasn't involved in that at all. But I can say Sam was a producer only because he owns the book. He and Danny own the book. Sam had no involvement or no say in what made the film or didn't make the film. He gave us free reign. And he and his family, they're really, really happy with how he's presented, and really proud of what we did. So it really made us happy. But that wasn't our goal. Our goal was not to be a fluff piece trying to make any. We really wanted to go into this in a true documentary fashion and tell the story. One of the challenges we had, I'd worked on an 85 Bears movie. We were the other one, not the 30 for 30, but we were doing one that was the 30th anniversary. And ours did well too. It got released. It was DVD and all that stuff. You could buy it in stores. It was called 85, the greatest football team in sports history. If I butcher the title, I apologize. But it was interesting because I was shooting that film as we were also doing this one. And so we were interviewing all these, former Bears players from the 85 team, Ditka, and all these different players. It was really interesting to me as we saw our film, and then you see the one that ESPN did. And, you could almost intercut between some of the stories that we were told and some of the stories they captured. This idea that these tall tales where, it grows over time, and they've told the story so many times that it kind of becomes almost scripted, where there's like the punchline and all of this stuff. And the big challenge we had with Sam, and it was interesting is that, we had that same challenge with these Bears players, is breaking past that, right? Because Sam, there were several times where he would give us the same answer, and I'd see it in his book tour, I'd see it in whatever. It's the stories he would tell, kind of the the anecdotes that he has, verbatim. And it really took us. We had one of the pickup interviews. We told him, we need to get some, questions. We didn't tell him how long it would be. We ended up interviewing for like 3 to 4 hours. And by the end of that interview, he started to get pissed at me just because I didn't think he thought that was going to be as long as it was. But that emotion started to break through that barrier. And it ended up being some of our best stuff, right? Where it's the stuff where he actually gets past the stuff that was rehearsed. And we started to see this real emotion. And I was like, so it was kind of this interesting lesson just in general of like, dealing with people who have well-known stories or stories that have been told many, many times. There's a real challenge of getting past that, of past the, the tall tale that's been told time and time again. Well, how do you get that from a different angle, or how do you get something that's fresh, right? Or because that emotion at that point literally becomes rehearsed. It's part of the story. So how do you get an actual genuine reaction or a fresh take on something? And that was a challenge we had for this project for sure.
So what's next for the film?
That's the question I think everybody, every filmmaker faces. There's a little bit of a challenge because we own the doc rights, and actually, because the Belushi story is an interesting one, because Danny and Belushi were friends from college. That's how we ended up getting him to do our voiceover. So Belushi and a number of other people own the rights of this as the option to the narrative version of this, right? And they're obviously, so the trick is, do we release? They're trying to get the narrative made. COVID has obviously complicated things, so they're trying to obviously pitch the narrative for a mini series or like a television show. And then, so the complication is like, we're trying to work with them to not undermine what they're trying to do, just out of respect for them. I've had several offers from distributors, and, we're just trying to find the right fit. I think for anybody who's made a film, making a film is a massive challenge. Finding a distributor that you feel is a good fit, that you trust, and that you feel like you're in good hands, that's the hardest part, right? Especially if you've got a project that I think people want to see. We went into this was before Making a Murderer and all that stuff. Like, we had no idea that we'd be sitting on, a very popular genre of film. We just wanted to make a good film. But now that it's finished, we obviously want people to see it. And so we're just trying to find the right fit. So we're hoping it's going to be on the online platforms. One of them, obviously in the near future is our hope. So we're not, we'll see. And then, the eternal question of what's next. I jokingly tell people I want to do something about like puppies or something, because living with this for so long, I had a box of Gacy stuff in my house for a while, and I don't really believe in, I'm like I believe in like energy and higher power and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not the most religious, and I don't believe in like the idea of like juju or something like that, or bad, whatever. So for me, it was just a box of stuff. But my wife was like, get that, because it was in our basement. But it would be like his confession, his death row Bible. It was like a box of Gacy stuff, like because we were, photographing it, and we just wanted to archive it. So having that in the house was not exactly welcomed by my wife. So yeah, I do. But there is a part of me that just kind of wants to, because the challenge you have as a filmmaker is when you immerse yourself in murder and this type of story, as you're doing research, you find other like stories, you find other stories that are similar, and they start to branch off. So I found several other true crime stories that I think are interesting. The real question is, do you want to become the true crime murder guy? Like, I don't, I wouldn't mind if it's an interesting enough story doing another one, but it's not something I definitely, I'm open-minded, I guess, to what's next.
I had that experience just while listening to Serial. They briefly mentioned a case, and I did a little digging on the internet about the case, and I was like, this is a case somebody should do something with,
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there was so many, it was such a rewarding experience making this film. I mean, I grew as a filmmaker making this. This was my first, I'd shot, I don't know, more than 20 feature films, whether it's narrative and doc, and over 100 episodes of television. But this was my first directing effort, this film. And so for me, there was a bit of a learning experience just making it. So I felt like I grew as a filmmaker through the process of making this, and I would love to apply. And I've now since produced a couple episodes for some TV shows and stuff, but I'd love to apply what I learned and the experience I gained from this to my next project. And I think, I'm just longing for that opportunity, obviously, probably post-COVID. But yeah, I mean, there's so many moments in this film that I think, and it's, you learn as a filmmaker, you're like, people don't have to notice this stuff for it to be good. Sam at the end has big part of his defense is this idea of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? This Robert Louis Stevenson And as I was going through Sam's photos, and this has made the film, like when we show Sam as a kid, there's a picture of Sam at his table with his parents, and on the table is the Robert Louis Stevenson book collection. So, it's one of those things that, like, nobody's going to notice it that well while watching the film. But as a filmmaker, you're really proud of those little discoveries, those moments that are like, man, that's interesting that he had a love for Robert Louis Stevenson even as a kid, and then later in his career, this big closing to a case that would come back. This idea of, or Ernie talking about how he was one of my favorite interviews. Ernie, the gentleman who was in charge of the excavation site, just the emotion that came through. But he talked about how the construction company let him take the first swing at the roof, like to destroy the house. And we happen to find footage of the first swing being taken to take out the house. So just to find footage like that, as I'm doing, like, those are the moments that make it worthwhile, right? The going through archival footage and finding that moment of, there was a moment during one of the news clips where Sam's walking in to the courtroom, and then the families walk by, and Sam just stops in his track and backs up. And in the news clip, what's featured is the families walking by. And then I noticed in the background, I'm like, oh my God, that's Sam. So just as a doc filmmaker, there's all these wonderful things that, like, when you're feeling down and you're like, I'm going through hundreds of hours of archival stuff, basically by myself. Scott would help too. And, the editing process was, a lot of it was Jason Medea, who I definitely wanted to make sure, before we wrap this up, I wanted to just make sure I mentioned how critical he was to the project. He was one of the people who really helped shape these hours and hours of footage into the rough kernel, and then he and I kind of locked ourselves in an edit suite for an entire year on weekends. So our wives made sure they got really special credit because they basically gave up their weekends for almost a year. So Jason and I could do edit sessions on the weekends.
It's funny for narratives. A lot of times I'll ask if there's a moment of kismet where things just randomly clicked together. But I don't usually ask that of docs, especially editing heavy docs. But you gave me several of them right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to me because if you would have asked me in college, I would have told you, the cliche, I'm going to jump on a plane, I'm going to LA, and I'm going to be Mr. Big Time doing big Hollywood films. And then, life has there's a phrase I've learned, and it's an old, I think it's a Hebrew phrase. The man plans, God laughs is the phrase. So you might have these plans and think you know what you want to do, and then fate, whatever you want to call it, steps in and and changes the course of your life. I could not be happier not doing that. And I have friends that are doing really big, major Hollywood films, and there's obviously a little bit of what ifism. Like, man, I wonder. But I've got a loving family who supports me. A wonderful career here in Chicago, and I just love doing these types of projects. I found a passion for doing these smaller crew. There's less drama behind the camera just because when you have 30 or 40 people in your crew, even if it's a good crew and everybody gets along, there's different moods and everything gets, so I wouldn't mind doing a couple features, narrative stuff, I wouldn't mind dabbling back into it, but I'm really glad that I found this and this type of work. And it's really where I found the most success. And if you'd asked me in college, wouldn't even have been on my radar.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us and having this discussion. It'll be up on YouTube for everyone to check out when your film does come out on VOD or anything else.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for making this a reality. I know the challenges. I mean, I don't know all of them, but you've made it seamless for us as filmmakers. So I really want to appreciate all the time and effort you put into making this a possibility. And I'm hoping to have another film that we could show in person, and we'll be back to normal hopefully sooner rather than later.
We can hope. I feel like we'll be online again next year. We'll see.
Well, if anybody has questions or anything, I know you post these. If anybody has questions, feel free reach out, and I'd love to have any type of discussion or I'd love to answer any questions people might have, and appreciate anybody who checked out our film, and thank you for the support.
Cool. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
You too. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
I will.